I'm Julia Patrick. I'm joined with Jarrett Ransom, and we're having a few tweaks we might need to make. So Jarrett might be popping in and out. The nonprofit nerd and my sidekick since we got started. But best of all, Rick DeBruhl. My mom's going to be so impressed that I had you on.
It's nice I'm impressing somebody today.
No, you're impressing all of us. Hey, Rick DeBruhl is an Emmy award-winning author and broadcaster, but he's also written this fabulous book called The Right Speed. And it's all about communications, which of course is close to my heart, Rick. But when we booked you to come on, we certainly had no idea that we would have some of these issues going on impacting our society and certainly our nonprofit sector. But we actually have crisis that we're dealing with, and a lot of nonprofits are dealing in crisis. So this is really a cool way to kind of get everybody in. And I would love to talk to you about what is a crisis? Because as we were starting, we had this little chat about what is a crisis to somebody might not be a crisis to somebody else.
Yeah, and I often point out there's a difference between what I call crisis and turbulence. You know, turbulence are those things that kind of happen on a regular basis, and you know, if there's not one thing, it's another. And so as a result, what happens is, you know, sometimes we tend to confuse turbulence with a crisis. Crisis is that thing that goes to that next level where it's affecting people, it's affecting the environment, it's affecting animals, for example, and it's affecting the bottom line of your organization. You know, it's affecting your ability to either do what you do as an organization or the kind of money that you would potentially bring in as an organization. And it's not just a PR problem. I mean, it's really important to understand. I remember reading somewhere along the line that they were talking about Lori Loughlin, you know, the actress who's in the middle of the scandal associated with, you know, trying to get into college for her daughter and all that kind of stuff, the fake scholarships. And they said, you know, Lori Loughlin has a PR problem. And I said, Lori Loughlin doesn't have a PR problem. She's got a legal problem. Once she gets past her legal problem, then she can get to the PR problem. And it's important to understand that, you know, while they can be combined together, you know, sometimes you do have to separate them out and figure out what is the actual crisis. How do you manage the crisis? And then how do you communicate the crisis? And understanding how you communicate the crisis is going to have a lot to do with how your organization survives the crisis.
Okay, well, I just say let's close down this show right now, because what you just said, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that, and that is genius. I love, love, love that, because you are right. What is turbulence? What's a crisis? Two totally different things, and the PR component. I mean, Jarrett, aren't you amazed? I mean, we always say crisis, crisis, but we don't talk about that other piece.
I do think a lot of times a crisis really is what you just said, Rick. It's a turbulence, right? And right now it's a turbulence. It can certainly escalate. And when it comes to communication, I have a question, you know, about communicating internally with your immediate stakeholders, be it your staff, your donors, your community, as well as the greater public at large. So I'm sure you'll talk a little bit about that in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, because it's really critical, you know, and sometimes organizations are really good at saying, we got to put that press release out. We got to put that press release out. We got to go out to social media, do that kind of thing. And then they forget, well, what about your employees? You know, have you communicated properly with them? What about your board? Have you communicated properly with your board? Who are your stakeholders? Who have you communicated properly with them? You know, one of the things that's really important to remember, especially in a crisis, is that oftentimes, assuming you're running your organization properly, your employees are very likely your biggest ambassadors out there. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that they're included in what's going on, because every employee wants to know what's going on within the organization, right? They want to know that timely information is coming out to them so that they feel like they can move forward and do their job. And then you give them the ability to say, you know what? Tell your family, tell your friends. If you're on social media, go out and tell social media about what's going on. And then you need to communicate upwards to that board as well. If you've got a board and you're not keeping them in the loop and they find out about something because they see it on television or they hear about it on the radio. And you know, the other thing to remember, and this is critical in crisis communication these days, it moves so incredibly fast now. You know, it used to be that something would happen, you had time to regroup and think about it, all that kind of stuff. Now, communication moves so quickly with social media. Something can happen to your organization, and man, it's on Twitter and Facebook and everything else before you even realize that you know, the extent of the problem. So you've got to be able to move quickly. And the difficulty is moving quickly on multiple fronts. Like I said, your employees, the public, and the stakeholders, and most often your board.
So Rick, before we got started, you shared with us that you have kind of a one sheet that folks can get to you, reach out, and then you had a really great suggestion to put it on put it on your desktop so that when you do have an issue, you can go through it. Because really, I think it's about the preparation, and I'd love for you to chat a little bit about first steps and reactions, how you can navigate this. And also at the same time, we want you to give everybody your contact information. And if you miss it on this show, you can reach out to us, info@americannonprofit.com, jcp@americannonprofitacademy.com, and we'll certainly connect you to Rick. But let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so every organization needs some kind of a crisis communication plan. And now, I will tell you, there's some great organizations that do incredibly complex and effective, literally books that has every detail that you need. The reality is, first off, you know, most nonprofits can't afford to hire those companies. And in a crisis, if you haven't done, you know, especially if you're not an organization that's used to having a crisis, you need to be able to move quickly. So you can see I've put together what I call a one-page crisis communication plan. And anybody who wants this, you can get it right now. And the easiest way to do it, just go to rickdebrule.com/NPS for nonprofit show. Just all you have to do is put in your email address and your name, and you can download it immediately. And I tell people to save this, put it on your desktop, read it, and then forget about it. Once a year, your organization should have some crisis communication discussion. In a perfect world, it should be led by somebody who knows something about crisis communication. But at the very least, if you have that discussion, and this one pager, you know, it talks about understanding the crisis. It talks about who should be on your crisis communication team. You know, it should be the CEO, the second in command, for example, the general counsel, communication director. And once again, different organizations, you know, are different size. Sometimes you have all those people, sometimes you don't. How you have to identify a spokesperson, do that kind of thing. And then it gets into a little bit of the nitty gritty about how things move quickly. And as I always point out, you know, so the book I've written is called Communicating at the Right Speed. And the reason I call it that is because these days things move so quickly. And I think we make the mistake of trying to do everything at the right speed. We take things that shouldn't move quickly and we move them really fast. And then when we have things that, for example, that don't need to move quickly, we don't move, or that are moving quickly, we don't move fast enough for those. And it kind of reminds me of, if you ever watch basketball, when a basketball player sometimes is dribbling down the court, he makes a break and he gets to the top of the key, you know, that painted section, and he stops for a moment, he bounces the ball once, and then he makes a move to the right or the left, or he passes the ball. And that's the way crisis communication has to work. You've got to quickly get down court. You got to take that moment to pause, gather your information, realizing you can never gather enough information, okay? And if you wait to gather all the information, you've lost the battle. You take that bounce, that one dribble, you look around, you make your move, and then you go, realizing that, you know, you may take a shot that misses, but at least you're moving in a direction that's getting you closer to the basket, and hopefully your team is going to help recover that ball. But you can't treat everything the same. So there are times when you need to slow it down, you need to gather more information, but there's other times when you need to recognize that it is a crisis and you do need to move faster. You need to pull in people, get your crisis communication team moving, and boom, get off to the races.
Rick, thank you for that. I know that you had mentioned offline before we opened those digital doors that you said, you know, a lot of people don't have time to read a book during a crisis. And that is so true. So thank you for the resource of a one-pager. I will certainly be downloading it. I wanted to make note, you know, and all of this reminds me back to my undergrad. I'm an actual mass communication major. And I remember learning about crisis communication and what is the right time and who do you need to bring in. And then for a junior college in South Carolina, I actually served as their information officer. And wow, was that, you know, just an experience. And
oh, Okay, so this was what we were talking
And I
about.
was young in my career, a little, man, my internet. Well, I wanted to know, really about who might you pull together for that team to share in the community, and who's the best spokesperson?
So within an organization, it's got to be a relatively small team, because the bigger the team, the greater the difficulty in moving forward. And the team has to be people who are critical to the organization. And it's always hard when you're in the middle of a crisis and the CEO or the executive director is in the middle of dealing with the problem, and then to say, well, wait a minute, I've got the communication person off to the side. But you need to understand that if you don't yes, you can survive the crisis itself, but if you don't survive the crisis and communicate what you've done properly to your stakeholders, to the public, then your reputation on the back end may suffer. Yes, you win the crisis, but you lose the public relations war, and that's absolutely critical. So I go back to, it should be the CEO. It should be your executive counsel, your general counsel, whatever legal advice that you can get access to quickly. It should be a second in command within the organization, whoever that may be, just because you want at least a few voices. And then whoever your communication person may be. Ideally, the communication person should be somebody within the organization. I'm not a fan in general of outsourcing communication during a crisis for multiple reasons. First off, you're the executive director of the organization. You're the person who runs this organization. You understand it. You have that credibility. If you bring in a third-party spokesman, there's going to be viewed as a hired gun, a mercenary. Doesn't mean you don't want to bring in that third person, that outside party, for advice. But I believe in general, you should almost always use your organization, your spokesperson. Now, that doesn't have to be the CEO, because frankly, there are some CEOs who are amazing. They're charismatic. They can absolutely come down and do a great job of communicating what's going on. And frankly, there's other CEOs who just aren't that comfortable in front of a group. They're great at running an organization, but they're not great at communicating. So maybe you want the second command. Maybe you want the general counsel. Maybe it is the communication director for your organization. So you want somebody who is believable, and yet at the same time is comfortable in that environment where when they're having to face, whether it's the media or stakeholders or the public, that they're going to feel comfortable in answering those questions and not get, ruffled.
So Rick, let me ask you then this question, because in a crisis, oftentimes we don't have all the facts and we don't have all the information. And what's the best way to navigate that so that you don't look like you don't know what's going on and you're not in control, but you're genuine. You can communicate that you don't have all the answers. Not that you won't, but what does that look like?
So, as I always joke, there are plenty of ways to say something without really saying something. Number one, it's important to acknowledge the fact that you don't have the facts. When things are moving quickly, it's very possible that you're going to be in a situation where you're going to have to say, you know what, we're still investigating exactly what happened. I kind of walk people through about a 5-step process. The first is acknowledging what happened. When I used to be in the news business, I worked in local news for more than 3 decades. And I was always amazed when I would interview an organization and they'd say, well, we're looking into what happens. Like, no, something bad happened, okay? You don't have to look into whether something bad happened. We all know something bad happened. You can look into what your involvement was, that kind of thing, but acknowledge that something has happened and then move on beyond that. The next thing I always point out is you need to be empathetic. It's important that your organization comes off as somebody who cares about people, somebody who cares about the environment, as an organization who cares about animals, if that's what this crisis is affecting. There's actually a lot of research associated with public forgiveness and the fact that the public is willing to forgive, but they're only willing to forgive if you honestly empathize and, if necessary, apologize for what happened, if you take responsibility for it. If you don't, you will be skewered. Now, don't get me wrong, it can take a long time to restore that public confidence, but if you don't do that. So once again, you've acknowledged, you've shown your empathy, you need to show what your values are, what you respect as an organization, why this crisis is not, doesn't show what you're made of. Other things show what you're made of. Then what you need to do is show what you're doing today There's this crisis going on. This is the action we've taken today to solve this problem or to deal with this particular crisis. And then finally, you need to show what you're doing in the future to make sure this crisis doesn't happen again. So you have to acknowledge, you have to show empathy, you have to show what your values are, you have to show what you're doing today and then what you're doing in the future. And honestly, I've seen some very well-crafted, simple paragraphs that say that. And if somebody says that on camera, great. If you release it as a news release, that's fine. But you don't want it to be too formulaic. You want it to be honest. And the other thing I will also tell you, and this is hugely critical, you have to tell the truth. Too many organizations have caused so many problems for themselves because they just wouldn't tell the truth. And they kept thinking, well, we'll spin it and we'll spin it and we'll spin it. And then eventually, as I point out, we live in a WikiLeaks era, right? There are no such thing as secrets anymore. Sooner or later, one of your employees, somebody you sent an email to, somebody is going to tell the truth. And you have to think, what's going to be worse, telling the truth today or having the truth come out and people accuse you of lying when you said what you said before?
Right. I have a technical question for you, and that is in an ongoing crisis. Do you think that it's appropriate to, well, it's two-parter, to actually have a physical distribution of information to all the reporters that you might come in contact with, or do you feel like this can all be done digitally? And then the next question I have is, do you think it's important to go into some sort of media environment whereby you might not have all the facts, but you could say, and we're going to gather again at 6 o'clock tonight or 10 o'clock tomorrow morning? Do you feel like you need to actually have an additional time set forth so that the media can come back and you can respond? Or do you think that that's old school?
So let's go back to the first thing, which is the distribution. Digitally is fine these days. Everybody moves faster digitally. And in fact, you can use your social media channels to put that information out. The concept of the news release is great. There's still some people use it, but in reality, there's so many channels, the reporters, the news media who are following this crisis, following your organization, are probably looking at your social media. And most importantly, all those other people, and once again, the other stakeholders, whether it's the community, your clients, whatever it may be, are looking at those, and your employees are likely looking at those as well. If you want to do a physical distribution, you can still do that if you've got the staff, and you can do that, but there's electronic ways that'll do it faster. It's really important to understand how fast news and information moves today, especially in a crisis. And, there's a lot of research associated with what they call kind of the golden zone. When that first hour to 2 hours, if you can address information there, and especially the issue with misinformation these days. I don't understand why misinformation seems to move faster than real information, the real facts, but it just does. And so if you let misinformation sit and you don't respond to misinformation immediately, boy, that misinformation is now gathering steam, and you're in a situation where when you try to defend it tomorrow or the next day or tonight, well, you've already lost momentum there. So you need to get out in front of that misinformation as quickly as possible. And once again, you're not going to have all the details. I can tell you this right now. For whatever crisis you're going to be dealing with, you're not going to have enough information. You have to gather the information you can. You have to correct the misinformation, and then you have to tell people, we're gathering more information. We'll get back to you when we can. I hope that your organizations, these nonprofits who are listening, aren't in a situation where they have to say, we're going to have another news conference at 6 p.m. tonight. If you've got that, you've got a major crisis.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that you can't at 6 p.m. or at 4 p.m. update your social media page and say, hey, we've learned a little bit more information. Here's what we know today. Get more information, put it out there and say, and by the way, we're going to keep you posted tomorrow and as we go through this.
Okay. Yeah, we work with so many nonprofits, I think, that do have, a public safety element to it. And so a lot of times they're navigating or having to do a joint work with literally the public safety departments within their communities or whatever. And sometimes you can just see that that's, fraught with a lot of problems. And if it's not well organized, everybody loses. So I love your comments. It's really hard to believe, but we're moving through our half an hour super fast. And before we really let you go, I'm really interested in your crisis communication plan. I want to make sure that we get people to know that they can come back to you, go to rickdebrule.com and get that one sheet. I think that will really, really help. The other part of this is that this communication plan, do you think that this is something that we're not spending enough time on, or we're spending too much time on, or can you give us some thoughts on that?
It really depends upon your organization, the size of your organization. I mean, if you got 10 people in your organization, you're having a hard enough time paying the bills, doing the work you need to do. If you've got if you're Apple, if you're McDonald's, you've got an entire team not only devoted to public relations, but probably to crisis communication. It's what I think every organization needs to do. I used to work for an organization, a nonprofit, that had an active shooter drill every year. And it's a great thing to do. I mean, make sure people understand where the exits are, what happens, okay? But and as a refresher. Now, in reality, did I feel if an active shooter walked in the door that I was going to be ready? Probably not. But at least I talked about it. And I think that's what you need to do within a nonprofit for crisis communication. And like I say, go to my website, look at this, once again, it's rickdebrule.com/NPS for nonprofit show, just a quick one-page crisis communication plan. But whether you use mine or use somebody else's, there's plenty of research out there. If you just Google crisis communication plan, you'll see plenty of information. Just have something that once a year within your organization, you have that discussion. If we had a crisis, and it's important to understand there's like two different kinds of crisis. There's internal crisis and there's external crisis. I mean, you look at what's been going on around the country where you've got riots. So let's say you've got an organization and you just had your windows smashed and there was looting at your facility, and now you can't do what you do as an organization. Well, that's an external crisis. It affected you externally. A tornado hits your town and now your office has been destroyed. That's an external crisis. Internal crisis is when, the CEO's embezzled some money, you've got somebody who's got a problem with sexual harassment, or organizationally you've done something that's wrong. And you kind of approach those differently in terms of the way it works. But if you have that discussion once a year to say, how would we handle a crisis? How would we handle an internal communication crisis? How would we handle an external communication crisis? Who are our stakeholders? How are we going to communicate with employees? If you just have the discussion at least once a year, honestly, you're better off than most organizations.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I really do. And I think that, to your point, understanding who's going to be speaking, who's up next, who's on the bench, you want to be able to understand how that goes. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you do some media training, right? So that if you have folks on your board or within your executive team that might need some of that, because crisis comes. And Rick, I loved what you said, turbulence comes, crisis comes. And so it's a lot better to feel confident so that you can deliver your message and understand kind of what's going on. Because if you can't deliver your message well, sometimes that becomes the crisis.
Yeah, and media training is great. And once again, that's one of the things I do. There's plenty of great media trainers out there. It's good to have already done it before your crisis hits. It's always great to have it when you've got a good news story that you can talk about. It just makes you a little more relaxed if you've already had that training. So when the news media is there, you know how to do it. And realizing that even today, that's changing. I mean, these days with media, a lot of them aren't showing up at your door anymore. Now they're calling you saying, hey, I need a quick Zoom interview. Well, now how are you going to do that Zoom interview? How are you going to respond? It's changing some of the ground rules about the way all this works.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you have been an amazing guest. I have just so enjoyed the things that you've shared with us. I think that, again, as we said, when we booked you and we had you come on, we had no idea the tenor of what would be going on in our country right now. And so a lot of our nonprofits are on the front lines of that. And so it's even more important. Rick DeBrule's information is on our screen. Here's his book. It's really interesting. I really liked it. And it actually got me, it's kind of almost like a workbook format in some ways. So it helps you look at your own situation through the lens of media standards, but also gives you an opportunity to fill in some of those blanks that maybe you haven't thought of. So communicating at the right speed, 52 ways to fix your professional communications troubles, and they will come.
Well, I mean, the reality is none of it, I joke, I'm theoretically a communication specialist and I screw it up all the time, so it's one of those things where it's just a matter of every now and then taking a step back. You talk about the book is pretty quick and easy to read. It's called Micro Learning. It's like 3 to 5 minute modules. Cause I figure people are so busy these days, they don't have time to read a lot of books. So I have a keynote I do where I talk about the importance of communication. I have certain strategies, but the last thing I always leave people is, you're only as good as your last communication, whatever that may be, because, people don't think about, people don't save an email from 5 years ago or a news conference from 10 years ago and think, oh, you did a great job. If you've got a crisis today, then have you communicated that crisis today? Have you communicated with your staff? But while that sounds negative, the advantage is you're just as good as your next communication. So if you haven't communicated yet today, if you need to communicate in a crisis, get back up on the horse, send that email out, do that social media, whatever it may be, you're back in charge again.
I love it. That is wisdom of the ages, because that's absolutely true. Tomorrow is always another day, and get back in there and keep creating those opportunities for yourself and for your nonprofit. Hey, Rick, you've been amazing. Again, I'm Julia Patrick and Jarrett Ransom, my co-host, the Nonprofit Nerd. We've been thrilled to have you join us. And we want to thank our sponsors that have been so fabulous in supporting the nonprofit show. Join us tomorrow. We've got another great show lined up for everybody, and we will keep going forward. We've got so many opportunities to come back on, and so reach out to us, rickdebrule.com/NPS. You're going to get that document, and if you can't reach it that way, email us and we'll get to you. So as we've been doing, signing off saying, stay well so you can do well. I'm Julia Patrick. Hey, Rick, thanks so much. We'll see you again.
Thanks for having me on, Julie. Appreciate it.
Bye.